And that was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Just the whole idea that protein, especially from animal foods, might increase cancer, that was heresy. And so things did happen. I was quite active in my national professional society. In fact, I just been chosen to be president by the executive council. So when they heard me go and saying these kind of things, they got very upset. People in my community got very upset. And they then organized a petition to have me thrown out of my society. The first time in the history of the society. To say nothing of the fact that I wasn't named president, obviously. They just did some other things.
Are you ready to live the life you deserve? Do you want to feel vibrantly healthy and reach your optimal weight without dieting while being kind to animals and the planet? Then you're in the right place at the right time. Get ready to hear from doctors, nutritionists, experts, and everyday men and women committed to creating a powerful life in mind, body, and soul through ethical food choices. Welcome to Plant-Based Eating for Health with your host, certified plant-based nutritionist, Kathleen Gage.
Well, I am so thrilled to have Dr. T. Colin Campbell with me today. I have been a huge fan of this man for quite some time, and I blame him for the reason I am so involved in the plant-based eating community. And Dr. Campbell, great to have you here.
It's a pleasure. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Me too. You know, I actually read the light reading of the China study. That actually was probably one of the most in-depth books that I read about how nutrition and plant-based eating really impacts our health, and would love to get in that conversation today, and also what's going on with COVID, what you can recommend for people to really improve their health with plant-based eating. So with that, I'd love to get a little background for my listeners and viewers on how did you get involved in this whole movement?
Oh, it was to some extent almost accidental. Not completely, but I was raised on a dairy farm, as you know, milking cows, and went away to graduate school eventually, and did a doctoral dissertation on, of all things, did a doctoral dissertation on an attempt to improve on the production of animal-based protein so we could consume more of it. My professor, by the way, was the son of a butcher from Bethesda, Maryland. But in any case, that's what I did, and did that thesis. Later, I was at Virginia Tech for my first faculty position, and there I was involved in, I was asked to be a coordinator of a State Department funded project in the Philippines on feeding malnourished children. And there, again, it was all about protein. You know, we were, just not myself, but, you know, others in my community thought that one of the reasons for malnourished children in the world was the fact that we weren't getting enough protein, especially good quality protein. So I went about that kind of work, but then I saw something that was kind of odd, namely that the few children getting enough protein, not very many, but the families at least who were getting enough protein, their children seemed to have a higher risk for getting liver cancer, which is really kind of odd. It caught my attention because I was also there setting up a laboratory for measuring a carcinogen in food that actually gives rise to liver cancer. So I was going down the road with the presumption that a chemical causes liver cancer. And instead, what I was beginning to hear, hey, wait a minute, you know, nutrition might play a role here, and high animal protein diets might be a problem. So I came home, and Virginia Tech and I organized a project with the National Institutes of Health funding, which lasted then for the next 27 years, that one project. It kept renewing it on and off. So I got into it just with a fairly simple question in the beginning. Is it true that increased consumption of protein might increase cancer? That's really kind of odd. I mean, that's my background. That's why I told you my background. And lo and behold, we started doing some research, and yes, it looked like it was. It was really quite dramatic. So the first experiments we did on that were such that it was a very provocative idea. I mean, it took a while for me to digest it, no pun intended. But as we kept looking at this question in more depth, I kept running across things over the years with lots of students, a lot of graduate students especially. I kept seeing things that were even more provocative, I should say, really challenging to the way we think about nutrition, and challenging also to the way that we understand cancer and how we treat cancer and diseases in general. So one thing led to another. I eventually organized a big study in China, looking there with colleagues from University of Oxford, especially an epidemiologist was world-renowned. And so he and I and our colleagues in China did that study. And that study was, the New York Times called it the Grand Prix of all epidemiology studies. And what we did, we were organizing a survey of what turned out to be 170 counties, or, no, I'm sorry, 65 counties, 170 villages, collecting all kinds of information, blood samples and urine samples and food samples, etc., questionnaires. And so we ended up with a huge volume of data, really huge volume of data. And we had, I think it was 367, what I would call items of information, different mortality rates for different diseases, as well as, things measured in the blood, nutrient intakes, and some viruses. We measured some viruses in those days. And so all of that said, we eventually had, I think it was like 24 laboratories from around the world who were participating in analyzing things. And we tried to get the best labs that we could get our hands on. And so it became a cooperative project involving, as I say, 24 different research laboratories located in 4 different countries. And with all the data that we had collected in rural China. And I learned something about, of course, why cancer was localized, more so in certain parts of China and not in others. I mean, cancer, the Chinese had established an atlas of cancer rates for all these different cancers back in the 1970s. And what was apparent was that these we solved these geographic localizations of different cancers, about a dozen different cancers. And so we had a range of cancer rates, which were extraordinarily broad. I mean, if we see a 2 to 3-fold range in this country, that's about what it is. In China, we saw up to maybe 100-fold range. And so, and the reason for that was that the people living in rural China tend to live there all their lives, and they produce locally produced food. So in some sense, it was a perfect, an ideal setting to learn something, because we had this big range. And then we could analyze, sensitive correlations, if you will, between various and sundry nutritional factors and various kinds of cancer. And eventually the Chinese government then gave to us another 36 different kinds of diseases as well. And so we had all these diseases and all the different cancers, and just a huge body of data that we could have a look. And what really intrigued me was the possibility that here was a human study, a very novel, interesting, unique human study, a population, if you will, that enabled me to sort of ask whether or not the information we were seeing in our laboratory animal studies in the laboratory, whether that information, which was so provocative, as I said before, whether that was consistent with what we would see in humans. So the China study became valuable, I would suggest, in large measure, at least from my perspective, because it was an opportunity to look at something, to compare laboratory results with human results, if you will. And then, of course, there's huge volumes of data in the scientific literature as well. So it was a combination of having access to two unique sets of kind of data. Oh, a third kind was in publication of studies of others. And so what I learned in a nutshell was that, yes, it was true. The information we were getting in the laboratory were by increases in the consumption of animal-based protein, not plant protein, but increases in animal-based protein was associated with things like an increase in blood cholesterol. Even though it was very low in China, and even though the consumption of animal protein was also very low, I didn't think I would see anything. But as animal protein began to appear in the diet in some areas, even small amounts, that tended to be associated with increase in blood cholesterol, which in turn was associated with Western kind of diseases. So then you turn to the evidence that's in the literature, a lot of it, and it turns out the China study became very unique in the sense it was kind of filling in the gap between what we sort of knew from the research literature, and also was, as I say, unique because we had an opportunity to examine what was going on here, in laboratory animals in the laboratory. So that's sort of in a nutshell. I also got deeply involved for about 20 years also in national policy development.
Right. Is that how you started Plant Pure Nation, was with the policy development? Because as I've researched you, and quite seriously, you were one of the reasons that I decided to, initially it was going to be a 7-day trial on plant-based eating, and I had such amazing results so quickly, like inflammation. That was the beginning of getting rid of my inflammation. And I watched the Plant Pure Nation movie. I read the China study, and there were periods where trying to get certain legislation passed, you and your son ran up against a lot of problems with that. Can you talk to us about the whole issue of legislation? And I'd love to talk about how that's impacting factory farms right now, people's health with COVID-19, things of that nature.
Right. By the way, the Plant Pure Nation was directed by my older son, whose training is in economics and business, and he did that. Obviously, I was part of that. I mean, I was in it, but that was in some ways it was a takeoff from Forks Over Knives. Forks Over Knives was the first film, and that came from the China study, and that was another group out in California. And what I heard, and I guess they heard after it came out, was that, why haven't we heard this before? And so Forks Over Knives was myself and my friend Dr. Esselton with the heart disease work, and some others. And so the public was kind of puzzled, interested, but puzzled. And Forks Over Knives became that's been an extraordinary film. But so to answer that question, why haven't we heard this before? That's when my son Nelson came into the picture, and he had this opportunity in the Kentucky legislature to broach the subject with the legislature, and that story that gave rise to Plant Pure Nation. Since then, he has a now for-profit company, I might add, that actually has a line of foods that is in major stores now. And we're very excited about that development. That's a for-profit initiative. He, in turn, is attempting to do it in a way in which is called a Newman's Own business model, where basically it's not, his interest and my interest has never been just to make a lot of money. That wasn't the purpose. He'd also doing the same thing, to create some dishes that are tasty and good. Thanks. And his wife, Kim, had a cookbook. So she was doing that part of it. And the food is being made at almost a cost, but, in those communities that need food. And so that's what that story is. And now he has a nonprofit called Pods. There's about 400 pods and about 250,000 members. But so that's a whole story. coming back to your question now concerning the political issue, the Planned Parenthood, as I say, was an attempt to try to, at least for me, try to get some information on why people haven't heard this before. And obviously, politicians get involved, as we all know. And that whole story about the political arena and business bureaucracy and government participation too. I mean, I consider the role of government and industry to be one. They work together,
Mm-hmm.
and I really got a good taste of that. When I was in policy development, working in Washington in various situations. It's very sad. It's almost scary. So the public tend not to know all of this. And there's a reason. It's not that I would say it's not really that the public's not interested. I mean, the last time I checked, I think everyone wants to be healthy. I don't think anybody wants to be sick. And so, quite frankly, the public is not getting information, period, except the dribbles and drabs. And when it does come out, the government and the industry in particular like to kind of, play it down. Or, in my case, like come after me, which they did in a big time way. So that's a whole story.
Well, can you talk a little bit about how the government came after you? Because what I'm noticing right now is with the whole issue of the factory farms shutting down, there does seem to be a renewed interest by the public about what's really going on with the health of the meat that ends up on their plate. How good is it for us or bad for us? Obviously, we know it's bad for us. But what did they do to come after you, and how do people combat that and really educate themselves?
Well, I have a new book coming out in December, and I should review a lot of those questions in that book. I tell stories, and at the same time, it's my attempt to go back into the history, back to the late 1700s, and sort of see how this whole story unfolded. Particularly how the medical industry, for example, came into being, and why it in particular wants to ignore this kind of information, and how the government policy communities. And so that's coming out. But to go back to your question, the political arena is tough, and they like to come after it. I became a target, and that started, I think, in earnest in 1982, when I was on a committee of the National Academy of Sciences, a committee on diet, nutrition, and cancer. And at that time, Senator George McGovern, in the 1960s, in the U.S. Senate, he came out with a report from the Senate, a little bit superficial, but nonetheless came out with a report in 1977 to suggest that we should eat more vegetables and fruits and cut down on fat intake. That was greeted with a great deal of hostility on the part of the industry. But it was focused on heart disease. So the senators in turn wanted to know, well, what about cancer? And so they invited in for testimony the head of the Cancer Institute, who went to give testimony. And his answer to their question was, well, we're not doing much. He says, 2 to 3% of our budget is for studying diet and cancer. And so that was a bit of a shocker. So the Senate then said, well, okay, you're not doing much. Here's $1 million. Go back and get something organized. And so they gave, more specifically, $996,000, but I don't know why it was that way, but that was given to the National Academy of Sciences to do a study. And I was one of the members, one of the 13 members on that panel, so-called experts we were considered. We worked on it a couple of years, came out with a report. And on that committee, I was only one of two members who had been doing experimental research at that time. And I was kind of into the protein question by then. And so the committee wanted to, at the suggestion of oversight people like, maybe senators and academy people and so forth, we wanted to divide the book up into have a chapter on fat, one on protein, fat, fiber, calories, vitamins, minerals, etc. And that's the way the book was organized. Ended up being about a 500-page book. And by the way, it was also the most sought-after report in the history of the National Academy of Sciences. So it got a lot of attention, And I, in turn, on the committee, we were making all these chapters up, and I was suggesting to my colleagues, hey, I want one on protein. It was really interesting. They weren't particularly interested in having one on protein. There were epidemiologists and people like that, a couple of government representatives as well. And so I really kind of insisted, I want to write one on protein. So they basically said, okay, you do it. So I did the draft, pretty much wrote the chapter on protein. So after this report came out and was greeted the way it was by industry, the first thing industry did, they came up with their own little superficial report and put it on the desk of every one of the 535 members of Congress, saying this is a bunch of trash, essentially. But I was the one who was asked by the Academy then to give testimony before Senate and House committees in behalf of the committee. I did that. And of course, I was doing other things. Unfortunately, became very public. I was on PBS and in magazines and so forth, and I would tend to talk about protein. Well, I have to tell you, in that chapter I wrote, and that was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Just the whole idea that protein, especially from animal foods, might increase cancer, that was heresy. And so things did happen. I was quite active in my national professional society. In fact, I'd just been chosen to be president by the Executive Council. So when they heard me go and saying these kind of things, they got very upset. People in my community got very upset. And they then organized a petition to have me thrown out of my society. The first time in the history of the society. To say nothing of the fact that I wasn't named president, obviously. They just did some other things, and it was a big to-do. And I also held some other positions at the time, quite prominent positions in and around the government in science and so forth and so on. So they did everything they could to, it didn't succeed. They didn't throw me out of society, but they did everything else that they could. There was an attempt to have me thrown out of Cornell when I had tenure. So it went, and that went on for 40 years.
Oh my gosh.
And it's still today. It's still that kind of thing exists. And put it in a nutshell, one of my colleagues who was on the inside of that hearing in 1982, who knew the discussion, I sort of knew this discussion myself, but he kind of put it succinctly. He said they were investigating me, they were mad at me because I had betrayed my research community. And what that meant is an interesting word. What that meant, I had gone against the grain of what people think is nutrition. So all the years since, that's what I've been wrestling with. What is this nonsense about running against the grain of nutrition? Well, I know very well what it is, and I'm telling it in the new book. And it really has to do with, I don't know whether we have time to go into all that stuff. But
sure, this is intriguing to me. First of all, what's the name of the new book? I want to make sure that people can pre-order it.
Yeah, The Future of Nutrition.
The Future of Nutrition. Okay. Yeah, I would love to hear, the underlying reasons. I have my assumption, but I'd love to hear it from directly from you.
Well, the book tells that story. As I say, I go back into the history, which is really interesting, by the way. I got, when 1985 and 86, not long after that Academy report, and all kinds of nonsense was coming forth, and, I really kind of was taken in the neck, if you will. And I went on a sabbatic to the University of Oxford. Oxford was our partner in doing the China study at that time, and we were just organizing that. So I spent a year at Oxford, and we were kind of collecting our data from China on the one hand. My Oxford colleagues were doing much of that work, but I spent the year sort of asking myself a question. what is all this hostility? I mean, really disgusting hostility, and something the public never hears. I think a lot of the public are suspicious sometimes, but they have no idea what goes on behind the curtain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's just the way it is. And so one way to tackle that question was, I thought was, let's go back in history and see if there's something there that might explain things. And I did that in part because on our National Academy panel, we thought we were feeling kind of smug and we were the first ones to come along and saying it died related to cancer, et cetera, et cetera. And we talked about, some other work that was going on before us back to 1931. What I come to find out was we barely touched the surface. There's been a lot of research on diet and cancer going all the way back to the late 1700s and 1800s. And when you look at that history, that is one of the most exciting stories of all. When you look at that history in the context of what is science, what is medicine, what is the medical system, how does that come into play? How does that play in the arena of politics? How does that play, let's say, in the formation of institutions and government? It's a fascinating story.
As we watch what's going on right now with the shutting down of factory farms, but then it's been pretty much mandated for them to open up because people need their protein. Supposedly, that's what President Trump said. It's like, we've got to open it for protein. But then you look at what animal product does to people's health. And I actually went through your course through Cornell University. I got my certificate of completion on March 2nd. Phenomenal course. And I highly recommend that people definitely enroll in that and go to a deeper level with what the whole plant-based lifestyle and eating is all about. But when you look at it, the disease is, I should say, that animal-based products cause, and then how that ties into our healthcare system and what's happening with the COVID and the underlying causes that cause the complications and all of that. It just seems like we've built such a house of cards, but it's so well protected by the political structure. And the future of nutrition, is that the name of the book, The Future of Nutrition?
Yes, as a subtitle says, an insider's look.
Okay.
What went wrong and how we might be able to get it right.
Okay, we'll make sure that's in the show notes. But what do people need to know about really the lies that they've been told? And it occurred to me the other day as I was just thinking about how much I've learned in the short time that I've been plant-based, and I love to do research. And it seems that we've really been brainwashed by the media and advertising and, all the misguided truths that we've been given on what's healthy and what's not healthy, when I'm a living example of how healthy I've gotten as a result of going plant-based. And it's sad to see how many people are so misguided. So why are they so protective over this? Does it all boil down to money?
It pretty much is. I don't usually end up saying it's all about money. Money is obviously the tool, the instrument. It's the passing of money, obviously, it goes around, but there's more than that. You go back into history when I'm not sure it was about money. At that time, in the 1800s, especially looking at the English history and the American history, and of course, when I was at Oxford, I was considering both, the unfolding of this information. And what I learned was that in the 1800s, actually late 1700s, and then it really became quite prominent. The argument became, or discussion became prominent during the 1800s. Cancer was emerging as a puzzling disease, and nobody really knew what it was, and so forth. There were two theories as to what causes cancer. One was called the local nature, the local disease, local nature of disease. In which case, the proposition was that cancer is a local disease, and it can be easily handled by cutting it out. Mm-hmm. That was the surgeon's point of view. And then the alternative idea was that it was called the constitutional nature of disease. And what that meant, the constitutional word really meant something larger, more vast, obviously involving food and other things as well. And it really came down to the idea that the body had a way, if you will, of sort of dealing with this in a much more complex way. It wasn't so local. Well, as the 1800s then unfolded, and there were some pretty serious debates at the time, you get into the late 1800s, early 1900s, and the local theory of disease idea basically took the form of not just surgery, but took the form of finding a chemical that could be targeted to the cancer. Or, in addition, with radiation being discovered in 1890, it was the idea of using radiation, a narrow beam of radiation to hit the cancer cells. So then we had three modalities: surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation therapy. They kind of emerged. And then that was all the product of the local theory of disease concept. In contrast, the constitutional nature of disease implies something more. That happens to be the role for nutrition. It has to be the role for food, more specifically. And that, I mean, one of the people who wrote that and really highlighted that in 1856 was a man who, I mean, this will maybe cause you to wonder what's going on here. But I was reading these books going back from 1931, back and finding books and reporting others and others. And I found some very significant people, scientists, who were arguing this two sides of the fence. And the ones who sort of stuck with the local theory of disease, they were the ones who were being attacked. Finally, I got to a book in 1846, written by a man who, I read the whole book. It was almost like I read that book and I felt like this is my book. I wrote that book, kind of thing. And I looked to see who the author was. He was a Irishman, born in Northern Ireland. He was a doctor. He became a vegetarian. All that word wasn't used in those days. He became a vegetarian when he was 41 years of age. He was a doctor, a surgeon. And he went on, he got caught up in the idea that the constitutional nature of disease was the way it should be. And he made it quite famous because he wrote about the originator of that idea was a man by the name of John Abernethy in the late 1700s. He was the founder of the St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, very prominent man. So the guy who wrote the book in 1856, his name was George McIlwain. So I saw that title or that author's name, and I couldn't help but think of something. My father is an immigrant from Northern Ireland. Well, he's been a farmer. He was entirely a farmer during his entire life. He only had a couple of years of formal education, and I was the first to go to college on either side of my family. So he came to the United States fairly young through Ellis Island and ran a farm. And in any case, we took him back to Ireland in his homestead, where he was born in Northern Ireland, just 2 years before he passed. That was in 1970. And we met some of his mother's. His mother, he was very close to his mother, but I didn't know his mother. It's my grandmother, because she was killed in a car crash before I was born, just before I was born. So he was talking to his cousins about his mother and that family. What became of them? Because she was the only child in that family, a daughter. And it turned out that her name is McIlwain. And in addition, my father, his middle name was McIlwain. And my son, who's now a physician, who co-authored a book with me, his middle name is McIlwain after my father. And so the McIlwain, that's my grandmother's maiden name. And she appears to be the daughter of the man who wrote that book in 1856.
Oh my gosh, that's incredible.
And then before him, but his father was a surgeon as well. And he worked for this guy, Abernethy, and there's the statue of Abernethy in London. So, on his work and others. So I feel like I kind of have a link without ever realizing it.
Absolutely.
They're sort of, and the same sort of, what's the same sort of idea. And this idea, let's go back to the idea again. The idea is such that that doesn't make money. Go back to your point. If you look about the constitutional nature of disease, you can't get your hand around anything in particular to sell, right? If you can't sell it, what's the point? I mean, so the local theory of disease came about, especially in the production of chemotherapy drugs or the use of, targeted radiation or whatever. That can be sold. Those products can be sold. So in a sense, you kind of take apart the food. That's the idea. You take apart the food, you fish out the nutrients, you maybe put them in a pill, you do this and that, you make chemotherapy drugs, all that kind of stuff. And that in turn, all those drugs comes from plants. I don't know if the public knows that, but it comes from plants like in the trees in the Amazon, and you may have heard that story. That's where drugs come from. But under the law, if you isolate a compound from an interesting compound from, let's say, a plant, you can't sell it because you can't. Well, you can sell it if you want to, but it's not worth it because if you can't get intellectual property protection in the form of patents, copyrights, and so forth. And so this is where the law comes into play. And so our patent system is structured in large measure to enable entrepreneurs and so forth in the area of medicine, at least. It enables them to identify a specific agent for treating a disease because they can make money. That's what it comes down to. So that's why I say it's not all about money. Money just turns out to be the tool or the facilitator of this kind of thinking. And but at the same time, this kind of thinking really does rest on the idea of being able to make money, make a business. So now we have a medical system that I have to tell you, I'm pretty critical of the medical system because the medical system does not pay attention to nutrition almost by design. The idea of nutrition being taught in medical schools is basically eliminated. So no doctors, no medical school in the United States teaches nutrition. If you stop and think about it, look at the roots of it. That's the constitutional nature of disease. You can't make money with it. You can make health, but you can't make money.
Right.
And the system is about making money, not health. Forget the health part of it. And so they will talk about making health. They're not making health. And so I get into that kind of discussion about looking at the present system. And then I all of a sudden begin to realize when you look at it this way, you begin to realize why nutrition was never taught in medical schools. So doctors don't have a clue about nutrition. They don't know about this. It's still the same way today. But yet they're the ones that tend to get recognized by the public as being authorities when they're not.
That's fascinating. And it's scary on the other hand, it's like,
yes, it is.
And just watching how people give their power away to doctors that don't have the knowledge about nutrition. I would imagine that the people who go through the plant-based nutrition course probably know more than most doctors. And what I found fascinating about the whole program was the module on studies and how to really dig deep to find out where did the funding for that study come from when, let's say, the whole dairy conversation about milk does a body good, and then you find out that most of the studies and reports that are done to really encourage people to consume more dairy products, it was all funded by the dairy industry or some company that has a vested interest in that. And really, for me, my whole purpose in bringing people like yourself, the experts, the true experts that can raise awareness is I want to do that for the public. I want to raise awareness and have people feel more empowered. What can people do in light of all that's going on right now with the collapse of our healthcare system, because we've seen it in different cities where it's literally collapsing, people's health where the obesity rate is through the roof. I've seen a lot of your recent articles and blog posts about the SAD diet and about the nutrition as it relates to COVID-19. What can people do to really start educating themselves and having more control over their own health?
Well, I can give you a self-serving answer. Take the course.
I'll say take the course. I was so impressed with it, and I already had done so much research. And I mean, I sat on the fence about deciding to take the course for probably 2 months. I would read through the information, and I was like, okay, will this really benefit me? What's my reason for taking it? And I thought it's worth the investment. It was definitely worth the investment because, one, I felt more empowered with the information, and two, the depth of information that you gave was compared to none. It was just hands down the best. So I do encourage people to take the course. In addition to that, just in family conversations, because I have a Facebook group that it's all about plant-based eating for health. That's what it's called. And there are people that are brand new to plant-based eating, and they're getting pushback from their families. And it reminds me of somebody who is an alcoholic. They go into recovery, and people wanted them to do something about their drinking. They finally did it, and now the family is pushing back. It's the same with somebody that is morbidly obese, and their family is saying, do something. They've done something, and now their family is pushing back. What can people do in that kind of a situation?
I want to add a comment about the course.
Yes.
I have never taken a single penny from the course, so I don't get any personal compensation for this. Just for the record. That's why I feel sort of comfortable with you talking about the course.
I appreciate that.
In any case, the question you're asking, you can think about it on a personal level, with family and friends, and we can think about it for ourselves, whether or not we have the willpower to do it, et cetera, et cetera. Also, there's another way of thinking about it, and I should mention this before answering the question fully, and that is that at the sort of 30,000 foot level, and I get this impression after having been in policy, like I was, there are certain things at the policy level that should happen, because they are what they are. That's why nobody gets to know this. Number one, medical schools should be teaching nutrition to the doctors, right? The right kind of nutrition, of course. I mean, medical schools, some medical schools will tell you, oh, we got some lectures, but it's the wrong kind of, it's nothing to do with this. So that's one way the government can step in, since they, underwrite the support for medical schools, that we should insist that medical schools teach nutrition, number one. Because we got a lot of great people going to medical school for altogether good reasons, and they don't get access to this information that's more powerful than anything else they learn, but they never hear it. That's number one. Number two, the National Institutes of Health, which is the chief funding agency for medical research in the world, actually. There's 27 different institutes in that so-called NIH program. They're the ones that funded most of my research, the Cancer Institute of all places. There's not one of those 27 institutes that's dedicated to nutrition. Not one. So nutrition is left out of that equation on the research side, is left out of the education side, okay? And then that in turn can be solved by simply creating another institute. I mean, I worked a lot with NIH because I got a lot of money from them, and I was also on their committees deciding what research projects should be and so forth and so on. So I know that system very well. But once again, a lot of good people succumbing to this big envelope, this big umbrella that controls all of our thinking, if you will. So that's something that should be done and must be done. And finally, on that same score, I think almost my number one recommendation at that level is to reverse the 2010 Citizens United Supreme Court decision. That is so serious. That is the time when for example, I'll tell you how this comes into play. That was when, in a 5-4 decision, the decision was made to essentially treat corporations and rich, very with lots of money, treat them as individuals, and they could send as much money to what they want to for politicians. So we have now what is I consider to be, and I got this from a friend who first said this, he was a lobbyist, we have the best government that money can buy. And as citizens, we can't do a heck of a lot. As long as that power is there, game's over, almost.
Right.
And so that right now, and it was a 5-4 decision, and that needs to be reversed. That's more important than the election of the president, because our country is doomed, at least in the area of health, if that's going to stay there. Because I've had I used to have quite a lot of experiences, in the Washington arena. I could talk to people sort of in the government and the offices and stuff like that. They were hamstrung. I mean, the politicians, they knew who paid for the election, and all the rest of them are working for a politician who had to run that in that system. So it's a dead zone. And so we have to figure out a way. The public tend not to know this, where the real power is. That's where it is. And if you cross their paths, forget it. And now we got a guy in the office, the White House, is about, he's the epitome of being a clown. I'm sorry, but I don't know what your persuasion is.
We're on the same page. We're definitely on the same page.
Anyhow, there you have it. Now coming back to sort of individual level.
Right.
We have one thing that's going on, which is kind of exciting. That's my older son, who did the Plant Pure Nation, founded this nonprofit group called Plant Pure Communities.
Yes.
And the Plant Pure Communities is run by someone else, a woman by the name of Jody Cass. But in any case, Nelson is my son's name. They are getting the ponds up and running, if you will. There's supposedly about 250,000 members have signed up, and it's here in 22 countries around the world. We're just kind of kicking it off, getting up the ground. It's kind of hard because you get all these organizations, and it takes a little money to run them sometimes. Not necessarily, but it's usually have some. Right. So my son has this really good idea, kind of got messed up with the COVID thing at the moment, but he has food entrees in some of the stores around the country. He was about to get involved with about 4 more big chains when the COVID crisis just came along, and they backed off for the time being. So he said, it's kind of hurting on that score. But the pod network, we're just now trying to develop information for them, so they get to know. And I like the concept. And the reason I like this concept is because this is how to reach the public. Grassroots, the local communities, and these people, they're all fans and they're enthusiastic, good people. They can do things at the local level of various kinds. It might start out with just meeting once a month and having a dish to pass, maybe, that kind of thing, watching some films and so forth and so on. But he's working hard, and I'm on that board too. And our center that you're familiar with actually provided funding for that to get going. So we're all kind of networked that way. And so I'm really anxious to get that pod network up and running. And if anybody's listening here, I'm going to take this chance, because it's not for my personal wealth. I don't take a cent of this sort of stuff. Anybody who wants to donate or help get that funded, I can tell you they would not spend a better cent in their lives than to support that movement. So let's see, I addressed that. The other thing too, so I call that the outreach, or the public outreach. Then of course we have the education that you know about. We have a third component, and that's my youngest son, whose middle name is McAway. He's a physician. He's the one that co-authored the book with me. And he's now a physician and medical director of a significant program at a big medical center. But now the hospitals are off doing their thing. And so he's taken up the research end of things. And he just recently published a paper on somebody with chronic kidney disease. It was fantastic. This man was 69 years old. He was obese. He had diabetes. He had hypertension. He had stage 3 chronic kidney disease. And so Tom put him on this diet, basically. He had been on 9 pills before that. 5 just disappeared like that. He didn't have to use the pills. And after 4.5 months, he felt like a new man at 69 years of age. It's similar to my friend Dr. Esselstyn and Ornish and McDougall and those guys. And Pam Popper and Columbus, Ohio, should throw us more names. There's a lot. I've got a lot of clinical friends, who are doing this kind of stuff. So Tom is doing. He's heading up the research thing. He gives lectures, by the way. Both of them are really good lecturers. And now our center is being the person there that's sort of strategic advisor is our daughter. It's going to become a family thing.
It's a family affair for sure.
But it's a nonprofit. It's all nonprofit, except for the part that's the selling food in the stores.
Right.
Which that's a B Corp, so they're going to put money back into these things there. So, anyway, we're kind of proud of the system, but at the same time, and I think that's tremendous. It has a lot to offer. It really has a lot to offer when you're combining this stuff. Okay, so people can get education with wish. They can read books. They should join pods, and get involved with some friends.
Right.
It's a nice social kind of thing, obviously, to the local level. And then the pods, they all meet, and maybe there's anywhere from 10 to 50 to 75 or so that will come to these meetings. It's quite nice. And then they can have speakers in and one thing. It's a nice grassroots sort of approach.
Right.
That's
Well,
really what it is.
Yeah, and it seems that's really where the power is nowadays, is for
Yes,
the
it is.
grassroots efforts, and for people like myself that, I'm starting my podcast show, I have a blog, I have a Facebook group, and all of this came as a result of seeing what a life-changing decision going plant-based actually is. And then it, of course, moved into compassion for animals, the environment, all of that, but it started with inflammation. Who would have guessed? So I'm really, really grateful that you have come on to share your information, because you are by far one of the most incredible human beings that for years has been doing this. And even in light of being, they wanted to shut you down, and you've been fighting that, and yet you keep going. What is it that drives you to keep going in spite of, or maybe because of the fact that you've gotten so much pushback? They've tried to shut you down. They've tried to, in some ways, destroy you, but you keep coming back, and it's like, no, I'm gonna make sure this information gets out to the people that need it. What keeps you going?
Well, lots of things. My wife, for one, we've been married for 58 years. She's changed our diet, obviously, and she has been a big I eat what she makes, and she makes terrific food. Her daughter, who now is with the CNS, she has a cookbook called China Study Cookbook. My daughter-in-law, that's Nelson's wife, she has another cookbook, Plant Purification Cookbook, Kim. She puts on cooking shows. So I got a really good support network for one thing. But at the same time, a lot of people elsewhere that's always supporting. My own point of view as far as putting up with the crap, sorry, that I've been put up with, is that at one point, the second book about Whole, I dedicated that book to all my critics.
Nice.
Because the more they do, as far as I'm concerned, I try to look at the more they lose. Because they only give me ammunition. They give me ammunition to know what's behind all of this. And we have really got some really big problems in the world today, as you know. The environment is a big deal. Cost of care is another big deal. Both of which is really centered on the food we eat. And so I think if you can turn these kind of experiences into something positive, then you can kind of look at them as they come along. Oh, well, thanks very much for demonstrating to me who you are, in a sense. The big thing I need to say is I have tenure. And this is almost my number one passion right now. I got tenure. Do you know what tenure is?
Explain it.
Well, tenure is for faculty. You're given, essentially you have to be for a while and prove your medal, but then you earn the right to have the job for life, unless you do something criminal or something like that. So I got tenure, which means academic freedom, really key. I got tenure when I was quite young, in my 30s. And so I've had tenure for over 50 years. That enabled me to keep my position and basically allowed me to say things that I otherwise might not have been able to say. Unfortunately, the tenure system that we have, it gets abused. Let's face it, some people get into that slot and they don't do a whole lot because it's a nice, secure job. But in reality, we have to deal with that. But on the other hand, we cannot take it away. Well, what's happened since 1980, if you look at the lines, the tenure has been going down, down, down. Mm-hmm. Right now, we're almost at a point right now where there's only a small fraction of people who really have tenure at the faculty level, have tenure, and there's the position to which they aspire. Mm-hmm. It's less than 10%. That has actually gutted the role of academia. Because the academics who are teaching and doing that kind of thing, if they stray outside the boundaries like I did, they're gone tomorrow. Because now the instructors in universities, they'll get a job for maybe a year or two or three, maybe 5. They will not get renewed. They got to play the game. It's that simple. So it's another very powerful thing, like the Citizens United thing of the Supreme Court. That plus the tenure in medical schools. Two big instruments, the instruments of power. And another one of those instruments of power is the dietary guidelines in Washington, which is really corrupted. It has been for quite a long time. And they don't tell. I mean, but the scientists who are putting that together, they're good people. They're kind of naive when they first get involved. But because at the end of the day, it's only the secretary who decides whether or not it can go forward or not. And the secretary is appointed by the president. So there you have it. They have control of everything. And so that needs to change. The dietary guidelines should be scrapped and done away with, started with something better. The government should withhold funding from medical schools unless they agree to teach nutrition according to what we know. The National Institutes of Health should have another institute dedicated to nutrition. And then, of course, at the more community level, support things like the pods. I think that's a great grassroots movement. And I would just say, once again, that's the one we're struggling with most importantly right at the moment, because it's hard to make those. We got to have some funding, and it's hard to get. In the case of the Plant Pure Nation, we've done quite well. I mean, the online course that you're familiar with, that's turned out to be quite successful. We're the #1 course for some years out of the 300 courses at Cornell. And so we've had a good run with that, and it's given us some funding to help get the research going at the University of Rochester, and also to help with the pods. I'm looking for somebody right now that wants to step up to the plate and do something big. And I'm going to tell them that they could not spend their money in a better place in the world than, to help provide a donation to the pods.
Well, if you could wave a magic wand and have that person step up to the plate, how much would you want them to donate? Let's just put it out there and say.
I don't know. We honor anyone who wants to donate, obviously. But the figures that are meaningful. The figures that are meaningful, I would say, is 50,000 and up, maybe 100,000 and up. There's people out there that have that kind of money.
Absolutely.
And so I'd like to say $1 million and up, but we'll take what comes. But that's the size of the check that makes the difference.
Okay. Well, somebody's out there listening right now and watching right now saying, okay, I want to make a donation. So we needed to give them a figure. So write that check for 50,000.
Yeah, just go to Plant Pure Communities. That's the name of the organization. You had another question before we get lost here in this. I'm anxious to talk about this, actually. It's the COVID thing.
Yes, I really want to address that.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you, I could talk all day long about that stuff, but anyhow, the COVID thing, as you know, is a virus.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty serious virus. I have some difficulty with the way that story erupted and came to the attention of the public. It was terrible. I mean, the government responded like clowns. They weren't prepared to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have the testing. We had to go through all this stuff. It didn't have to happen, in my mind, not quite that way. Right now, the way it is at the present time, I mean, we have a country that's really, we're all angry. Who wants to keep running through this stuff?
Right.
And the point is that these flus or these kind of these viral diseases they come on a almost an annual basis. Let's face it, we call them flus. This one here was a little worse than some of the others, of course. But we have some viruses that are really pretty serious. They cause cancer. And so all the viruses tend to operate from a biological perspective in the same way on one part of their activity. All these viruses, they don't multiply themselves. They get into a host, and that means a human or other animals or plants. They get into the host and they actually borrow or they usurp the fundamental mechanism by which cells themselves divide. I'm talking about DNA and the genetic basis of cells. So they get in there and they kind of use that genetic basis. And then that's what viruses do. And then they screw the cell up and make a mess. And all the different viruses can do different things. The one we have now, as you know, is particularly hard on the lungs. Others, can cause cancer. And some just on a regular basis every year cause something like the flu, the flu virus. And so they do different kinds of things. And we never know when one's going to come along that's pretty nasty. And the one we have now is pretty nasty. So what has been decided is we have to have 6 feet between us, and we have to, you and I are talking on this like this here at a distance. We have to do that, which is okay. We should do that. I'm not opposed to that, but that's not the solution. That's not the solution. We might deal with it for the moment. But my question is this what we're going to do for the next 10, 15 years? Every time one of these things come along, we all go into hibernation? And the other part of that equation is this. When the virus invades tissue, the body reacts in defense. What that means is our immune system comes into play. And so the immune system sees that foreign substance, as other, like bacteria and other things too. It sees that virus. And the body is really smart. It goes to work and starts creating antibodies. And antibodies, in effect, are deactivating the virus. Good thing. So we can get infected and then we become immune. Okay, that's the sort of the general idea. In the meanwhile, though, if we don't become immune right away, or we get a big, heavy dose of the virus, it can come in and do some damage. And the one we have now does some damage. And it kills people. And people who are actually now dying from this virus at the present time, most of them are over 60 years of age, not entirely, but they're over 60 are particularly vulnerable. And the ones who are dying are the ones who have not been paying attention to their nutrition during their lives. And the best way to deal with that is switch the diet. And so the reason I'm saying that with some confidence is because we have data from China. We were working with, there were 4 viruses. One of them we worked in some detail. It's a viruses that cause liver cancer. So we did quite a lot of research on that now 30 years ago. And at that time, we measured in people, 8,900 people, we measured how much antibodies was there for these different people. We measured how much antibodies there because that's telling us who's immune, who's not, and more or less, that's what the idea is. We also measured antigen, that's the active virus. So the virus comes in, right at this point, it's an antigen, it's active. The immune system comes in and sort of deactivates, it forms antibodies in some period of time. For a lot of people, they can become immune to the virus, and they're sort of home free. But a lot of people are not. And for the people who are already suffering to some extent ill health, they're susceptible. And now we know that a plant-based diet can actually, for a lot of people, reverse that. They can reverse that susceptibility. It's called comorbidity in those people. So the plant-based diet does that. Here's where, and I just sent in today, this is going to become public, actually, I think. It turns out when I went back to the China study that we did the second time in 1989, that included both China and Taiwan, we had data there at that time that we worked on in some depth about a virus called the Hepatitis B Virus.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had access to the amount of antigen that was in people and the amount of antibody was in people. We had information on how much liver cancer was formed because that's what was caused by these viruses. And in addition, we had lots of nutritional factors. Here's what we found. It's highly significant. The more vegetables that were consumed, and this is significant at the probability of 0.001 for those who are familiar with this kind of stuff. The vegetables the more vegetables that were being consumed, the more antibodies that were produced. Dramatic. The more animal food they consumed, and it only took a little bit, didn't take much. The more animal food is consumed, the less antibodies, and the more damage the virus is able to do.
Mm-hmm.
So the animal food, through its antigen virus, is associated with more liver cancer. And the correlation with liver cancer is spectacular. So I got a sort of a pathway, a fork in the road. Virus comes in, it can either form an antibody and then be deactivated, and plants do that. People eat plants, and that's the way it goes. Comes in and gets deactivated, no problem. If they're eating animal food, some of it's going to slip through and going to do its dirty work. Is that clear?
Oh,
Is
yeah.
that clear?
Very clear.
And so, yeah, and it turns out this kind of information has never been seen before, to my knowledge. So I'm just now putting it out. I put out a couple of kind of news releases. Right. And I'm hoping that it'll be picked up by some major newspapers on this, because I say, this is I have no proof of that. I have no proof in the sense that, okay, let's do a study and see what happens. I don't have that. But what I've got is a lot of circumstantial evidence that certainly points that way, because what happens with that hepatitis virus, I'm going to argue the same thing happens with the COVID virus. Because all viruses, the first thing that happens, they go in and they generate antibody production. And so if a plant-based diet is going to generate a stronger immune system, it's going to work for mostly all the viruses. And one of the reasons, and I just find this really puzzling, over the years, I don't know for sure, I need to go back and think about this more, but it seems like to me these virus flus are becoming, if anything, more common. We didn't used to hear them so much. And now it's very quite clear. They are acting on people who are not eating the right food, period. And so what you experienced yourself, what others experience who have heart disease or diabetes or that stuff, or overweight and stuff, they see these results because that kind of food and that nutrition coming from it, that deals with that and actually can reverse it. People get better. And it starts happening within days. It starts happening within days. It's spectacular. And it's across the board, from rheumatoid arthritis to you name it. I keep running into people all the time who get this kind of thing. But quite frankly, it's not recognized by the medical system. So they're treating it with drugs. They don't even know about this. They're not taught in the area. So they're off in Siberia someplace, practicing medicine. And the poor souls who are in the medical system don't realize what they don't know. They don't realize what they don't know. And as a result, from the policy point of view, as well as from the practitioner point of view, the public doesn't know what they don't know. And so when you come along and you for example, you get kind of interested in it, you do this, you go home and you can tell your husband or your family or whatever, you're going to try this here. Yeah, a lot of people get some pushback for good reasons because they never heard of it before. why do they want to give up their favorite food, bacon and eggs for breakfast? You know, and so and coming from the farm, I know that very well because that's where we did too. I mean, we changed because of this research that I was running across. I was kind of lucky, you know. So we did what we did, and so the question is now, how do you get this information to other people who are, in some cases, they're really antagonistic to the idea. Let's face it.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I think you really hit the nail on the head with the grassroots efforts. And, you know, what it's kind of like a virus. It's like, you know, one person impacts one person who impacts two people who impacts four, you know, and it just, we just keep the momentum going through the books, you know, and I'm really excited about your new book coming out. Definitely going to get it. And just want to say, Dr. T. Colin Campbell, it has been delightful talking with you. You have no idea how much this means to me because you were one of the early influences in me deciding to go plant-based. And, you know, I always think if I ever could sit across the table from somebody and really pick their brain, who would these people be? And your name was at the top of the list. And I just am thrilled beyond words that you have shared your information with my community because I'm committed to doing everything I can to raise awareness on what a plant-based diet can do for people, what it can do for the animals, and what it can do for the planet. So in closing, do you have any final thoughts for people?
I'm just gratified that you are doing what you're doing.
Thank you.
And, you know, and any people who are doing this kind of thing, because, you know, we're all into this together. And whether we know it or not now, we better know it pretty quickly because now the planet is being made sick. And
Yes.
we got to correct it, or none of us would be worth anything if we let that get out of hand. So I think that's the kind of the big ticket item. And yeah, we got a new course coming online, by the way, on food sustainability on that. So that's something else. And yeah, that's, I guess, my parting thoughts. I just enjoy being involved in discussion of this kind. And, you know, if you feel like it's worthwhile, it's doing some good, and I think it is.
Absolutely. And thank you so much. And you take care. And anything I can do to spread the word, you let me know, because I'm here to raise awareness. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your commitment to an ethical life through plant-based food choices. The kind of choices that are kind to your body, the environment, and most of all, animals. Be sure to leave a review and rating of the Plant-Based Eating for Health podcast show.